Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
You know that twisted little smirk people get when they say something that's meant to look like a joke, but really, it's a loaded punch dressed in Sunday manners? That was the expression stretched across my Uncle Rick's face just before he said it, leaning back in my parents' old oak dining chair, tapping the end of his fork against his plate like a goddamn conductor, waiting for his own performance to start. "You're still mooching off everyone, huh?" He snorted, loud enough that even the casserole dish flinched. I looked up from my plate, half a slice of ham, green beans I didn't ask for, and that watery potato salad Mom insists on making, and I smiled. That was my role in this family. The smiler. The nodder. The one who didn't rock the boat, even when someone stood on the edge and pissed into it. So I gave him a laugh, soft and sweet, like it didn't sting. Like I didn't feel the weight of every eye around the table land on me, not directly, but through the corners of their glances, the way people check to see if someone's gonna cry or crack. They all laughed, too. Not hard, no one really likes Rick, but enough to cushion his blow, like always. Dad gave a half chuckle while cutting his meat, not looking at me. Mom tilted her head and said, "Now Rick," in that sugary tone that carries less consequence than a paper napkin. My cousin Jess smirked without even trying to hide it, and my aunt, the one who always pretends she has a sinus infection during uncomfortable conversations, let out a noise like she'd swallowed her words. No one actually said anything to defend me. Not really. And that's when I felt it, not just the humiliation, but the shift. You know when you suddenly see everyone clearly? Like the fog lifts, and instead of a family, you see a circle of chairs where everyone's just waiting their turn to speak about someone else the minute they leave the room. That was lunch last Sunday. What no one at that table knew, and I mean no one, is that I manage every one of my parents' online accounts. I handle their bills, their insurance, their taxes, their password resets, their prescriptions, even their credit card rewards programs. Not because I'm some financial genius, but because my dad doesn't trust banks and my mom can't reset a Gmail password without calling me in tears. When I moved back in after my divorce, an event that had already tagged me as a walking pity party, I took it on. Quietly. Just like everything else. You want to talk about mooching? I kept their lights on when my dad forgot to pay the electric bill. I got their Medicare claims fixed when Mom's surgery went to collections. I stayed up late after my shift at the grocery store, Googling what the hell is a supplemental Part D so they wouldn't lose coverage. But none of that shows up on a Sunday lunch table. You can't plate that next to a spiral ham and make it look delicious. So I laughed. I smiled. And I chewed my food like it didn't taste like metal. That night, when the dishes were washed and the goodbyes were exchanged with hugs that didn't mean a damn thing, I went in my room, still painted lilac from when I was 14, and I opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue in the dark, that specific glow that reminds you you're the only one awake, the only one thinking. The vacation fund was in a shared online savings account, the kind that earns 0.5% interest if you're lucky. I'd set it up 2 years ago when Rick suggested we all go on a big family thing, Aruba or Cancun or wherever we can drink and not think. Everyone thought it was a great idea, but of course, no one wanted to manage the logistics. Guess who volunteered? Not Rick. Not Jess. Me. I was the one who opened the account, set the transfer reminders, emailed the travel agent named Angela, who, by the way, was more reliable than most of my blood relatives, and coordinated the deposits. The idea was to split the costs evenly, but it didn't take long before Rick started forgetting his share. And when I reminded him, he'd send $100 with a note that said, "That should shut you up for now." But he still expected the trip to happen. He still expected me to organize, book, print the itineraries, and smile while doing it. So I stared at that account balance, just under $8,000. And I thought about what it actually represented. Not a vacation. Not family bonding. Just an illusion that they were doing something together, built on my free labor and their laziness. I didn't rage. I didn't cry. I didn't even hesitate. I clicked transfer out, split the balance evenly back into my parents' checking account, and left Rick's and Jess's shares right where they'd always been, non-existent. Then I opened my email, typed up a professional-sounding cancellation notice to Angela, and even apologized for the short notice. I told her we'd decided to delay the trip indefinitely and appreciated her understanding. She responded in under 10 minutes. She's a saint, that woman. When I closed the laptop, I just sat there, looking around my teenage bedroom at the same posters still thumbtacked to the walls, the same books on the shelf that no one ever threw out. And I smiled for real this time. Not the tight-lipped, polite one I'd mastered at family events. A real, full smile. Because I'd done something. Quiet, yes. But sharp. Precise. They were gonna wake up thinking they were going to Aruba. I was about to wake up a whole different beast. There's something deeply satisfying, disturbingly so, even about disrupting a plan that everyone assumes will go exactly the way they imagined, especially when those plans were built on the back of your unpaid effort and your silent compliance. Like a house on a foundation of resentment no one bothered to check for cracks. That night, as I sat in the glow of my laptop, that thought rolled over and over in my mind like a wave smoothing down jagged rocks, reminding me that revenge doesn't always need to be loud or theatrical. Sometimes, it just needs to be quiet, methodical, and dressed in polite language sent via email. The morning after, as the sun sliced through the living room curtains and the scent of burnt toast wafted in from the kitchen, because my dad insists on using the same toaster he's had since the 1980s, one that burns everything no matter the setting, I heard the first sound of the dominoes falling. The slam of a phone against the counter, loud and sharp, followed by my dad's unmistakable voice, not yelling but firm, the kind of voice that says, "This better be a mistake," even though it rarely is. I stayed upstairs longer than usual, lingering at the top of the stairs like a kid playing sick on a school morning, listening to the muffled conversation between my dad and someone on the other end of the line, probably Rick or the travel agent, and imagining his face as he realized that something had gone wrong, that something he didn't understand was now unraveling without his permission. When I finally came down, feigning grogginess, Mom was already pacing around the kitchen in her faded robe, clutching her phone in one hand and a spoon in the other, stirring a pot of oatmeal she was clearly not focused on. She looked up as I walked in, and without a greeting or even a good morning, she said, "Sweetie, something weird is going on with the vacation. Your father just got off the phone with Angela, and apparently the whole trip's been canceled. Did you get an email? Can you check?" I blinked, played the part of the confused daughter perfectly, walked over to the table, opened my laptop again, and clicked around a bit, as if I didn't already know what I'd find. "Huh," I said, tilting my head slightly. "Yeah, it looks like it says the reservation's been withdrawn. Maybe there was a payment issue?" I glanced at Dad, who was standing near the sink, arms crossed over his chest, jaw clenched in that way he does when something isn't adding up, when the world isn't behaving the way he expects it to. He didn't say anything. He just kept staring out the window like the answers were hiding in the neighbor's backyard. The thing is, when I first set up that account and took on the role of vacation coordinator, it wasn't out of kindness or enthusiasm, it was out of necessity. Rick, as usual, had floated the idea in a group text like a monarch issuing a decree, and everyone, desperate not to look like the boring one or the difficult one, had jumped on board with performative excitement. But no one wanted to actually do the work. I had just gotten laid off from my office job at the time, and Rick had the gall to text me privately saying, "Hey, you probably have more free time than the rest of us. Mind taking charge of this stuff?" As if I wasn't in the middle of scrambling to find a way to keep paying my car insurance. I'd said yes. Because back then, I still believed that helping out was a way to earn a seat at the table again. Looking back now, I can see how foolish that was. That morning, as Mom fluttered around texting Rick and my aunt and anyone else whose vacation dreams had suddenly evaporated, I opened my email again, just to check for a reply from Angela. Sure enough, there it was, short, professional, and just attached enough to feel like confirmation that I wasn't crazy. She had thanked me for letting her know promptly, mentioned she'd canceled the resort bookings and the group excursions, and assured me there were no penalties because of our early notice. I stared at her signature, Angela Whitmore, family travel coordinator, and wondered if she had any idea just how much quiet chaos she'd just helped unleash. By noon, the group text was on fire. Jess, Rick's daughter, had sent a dozen messages in rapid succession, some of them confused, others increasingly aggressive, ending with one that simply read, "Seriously? WTF happened?" I didn't reply, not yet. Instead, I tapped over to her Instagram profile, which, as always, was a curated parade of performative joy, expensive brunches, fake candid laughs, grateful for my tribe. Captions under photos of friends she probably talks shit about behind their backs. One post in particular caught my eye. It was from a few months ago, a picture of her lounging by a pool with a glass of rose in one hand, captioned, "Some people move home after their divorce." I moved on. I remember seeing it when she first posted and pretending not to care, but that morning, with the memory of Rick's smirk still fresh and the collective whining of my extended family vibrating through my phone, I let myself feel it fully. Jess, like her father, had always had a way of saying cruel things wrapped in glitter. She'd been the one to tell me, back when she was planning her bachelorette party, that it was kind of a vibe thing, and that maybe I shouldn't come because it's gonna be a lot of couples and energy stuff. Translation: she didn't want her sad, divorced cousin ruining the photos. I'd said I understood, and she'd rewarded me with a tight hug and a post the next day that said, "Surround yourself with people who bring the best out of you." Back in the kitchen, Dad had left to make a phone call outside, probably Rick again, and Mom was now sitting at the table with her glasses on, reading every text aloud like they were news bulletins. "Rick says he wants to talk to the bank," she said. "Do you think someone hacked the account? I mean, this makes no sense." I sipped my coffee slowly, deliberately, feeling the heat in my throat, not from the drink but from the power. Because that was the thing they'd all forgotten, or maybe never realized. The one who handles the details has the control. The one they ignored, dismissed, pitted, that was the one who had the keys. The trip was canceled. The group was unraveling. And I hadn't raised my voice once. And as I sat there, watching my mother refresh her phone screen like the answers would magically appear, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I was going to make sure this wasn't just a one-time inconvenience. This was going to be a lesson. And it was only just beginning. There's a particular kind of silence that follows chaos, not the peaceful kind you'd find in a forest after a storm or in a house where children have just fallen asleep, but a tight, suspended, unnatural quiet where everyone knows something's wrong. But no one's willing to admit it aloud yet, clinging to the hope that maybe if they just stay quiet long enough, the truth will recede like a bad dream or a bill you pretend you didn't see in the mailbox. That was the air in our house 2 days after the trip had been canceled, the living room eerily still, the television on but barely audible, my mother pretending to focus on her knitting while glancing at her phone every few minutes, and my father sitting rigid in his recliner like a man waiting for the final verdict in a trial he didn't realize he was part of. After the Aruba trip was quietly buried under scheduling confusion and unexpected financial hiccups, the family's disappointment shifted gears into that more dangerous terrain, passive aggression dressed up as casual conversation. Jess had posted a story that morning of her sipping coffee with the caption, "At least I didn't need a family handout to go on vacation," which wasn't tagged, wasn't directed, but still managed to land like a slap across the face because everyone knew who she meant. And more importantly, she knew I'd see it. For years, my role in the family had been that of the unremarkable fixture, the daughter who came home after the divorce, the cousin who didn't get out there again, the one who helped with tech stuff but was never quite invited to the real table of successes, milestones, and curated happiness. They all thought they knew me, thought I was someone who would always nod and quietly fix what needed fixing, and never once speak out of turn or, God forbid, cause a ripple. They didn't understand that people like me, the silent ones, aren't devoid of rage. We just store it differently, let it simmer like a pot on low heat, not to boil over, but to steep until it becomes potent, undeniable, and sharp. It started with the family Spotify account, which Rick had insisted we create to save money, and then immediately added 6 profiles to, despite only paying me once, and even then, in cash that smelled like cigar smoke and self-importance. I logged in late that night, clicked through the user profiles, and removed Rick's and Jess's access with the simple swipe of a finger. Then came the Netflix login, which, ironically, Rick had set up under the profile name Family Boss, as if his delusion needed a title. Gone. Hulu, Prime Video, even the shared Kindle library where Jess had once downloaded a dozen self-help books and never read a single one, gone. I didn't send a message. I didn't offer a warning. I didn't owe them that. The next morning, the fallout began slowly. A text from Rick at 7:12 a.m. reading, "Hey, I think the Netflix is acting up, can you check?" followed 20 minutes later by, "Never mind. Fixed it," which I knew meant Jess had confirmed they'd been locked out. Then came the group chat, a digital place that had once been used for holiday plans and recipe swaps, now vibrating with tension thinly veiled as confusion. Jess asked if there was a billing issue. My aunt wondered aloud if the family plan expired. No one addressed me directly, but all the questions hovered like smoke around a fire no one dared look at. And that's when I realized something, not just about them, but about me. For so long, I had confused being needed with being respected. I had believed that quietly solving their problems, catching their mistakes, and cleaning up their messes was a form of love or loyalty or purpose. But it wasn't. It was servitude, dressed up in the language of family, and they had grown so used to me being invisible that now, even as I erased them one by one, they still couldn't imagine I was the one holding the scissors. Later that evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone, the kind you forget are even there until you start tapping aimlessly, pictures of birthdays, of Christmas mornings, of backyard barbecues where everyone's smiling but no one looks each other in the eyes. And then I found it. A photo of my brother, Michael, taken 5 years ago, sitting beside me on the porch steps, both of us holding coffee mugs, both of us barefoot, just staring out at the yard as the sun came up. He died a year later, car accident on a rain-slick road. Nothing dramatic, no one's fault, just a moment that took everything and left silence in its place. Michael had been the only one who never talked down to me, never treated me like I was wasting space or oxygen. He was the only person in the family who ever said, "You know you're smarter than all of them, right?" and meant it. After he died, I became the designated help, the person who reminded Mom when her prescriptions needed refilling, the one who called the cable company when Dad couldn't understand the bill, the one who figured out how to recover Rick's Gmail password because he couldn't deal with this online crap. I stared at that photo of Michael for a long time, feeling something rise in my chest that wasn't grief. Not exactly, it was something older, heavier. Like the ache of being unrecognized for so long that you start to doubt whether you exist outside of what you do for other people. My phone buzzed again, Jess, texting directly this time. "Why are you being so petty? This isn't like you." That sentence, that accusation, almost made me laugh. Because the truth was, she had no idea what I was like. None of them did. They only knew the version of me they'd constructed, the version who quietly managed the chaos so they could keep pretending everything was fine. But that version was gone now. She'd been erased right along with their login credentials. I didn't reply. Not then. Instead, I walked down the hall to my father's office, really just a small room stuffed with unpaid bills and dusty envelopes, and opened the drawer where he kept the old folders. I pulled out the one marked Amex Business, the one I'd been co-managing for years without thanks, and I quietly removed myself from the account. I didn't cancel the card. I didn't create a scene. I just stepped away, clean and silent, like a ghost exiting the room. And as I closed the drawer and turned off the light, I realized the most terrifying thing about waking up after being invisible for so long is that once you realize how much you're carrying, the only logical next step is to start putting it down. Piece by piece. Person by person. And they were just beginning to feel the weight of my absence. There's a particular energy that starts to gather in a household when something unspoken festers just beneath the surface, like a slow leak in a pipe that no one can quite hear yet, but that's already soaking the walls from the inside out. And over the following days after the vacation's quiet implosion and the digital purge that followed, that energy began pressing down on the walls of our home in a way that no one wanted to name, but everyone could feel. My mother became quieter than usual, bustling around the kitchen with a forced cheerfulness that made her movements look rehearsed, as if she were performing for an audience that had long since stopped clapping, while my father, never one to be overly expressive, grew more brittle in his routines, slamming cupboard doors a little harder than necessary, setting his coffee mug down with just enough force to make a sound without shattering it, as if trying to find the precise volume at which frustration could be heard but not questioned. I had expected the fallout from the Netflix and Spotify locks to stir the pot, and it had, but what I hadn't anticipated was how quickly suspicion would turn inward. They weren't ready to accuse me directly, not yet, not when they still thought of me as the non-threatening helper in the corner, but they were circling the perimeter of the truth like dogs catching the scent of something they weren't brave enough to chase down. I'd wake up in the morning to find my mother already scrolling through her messages, brow furrowed, whispering half-thoughts to herself about strange charges or Rick saying this wasn't his doing, while my dad, who had once trusted me implicitly with every account password, had now begun scribbling notes on legal pads and closing folders with a kind of nervous protectiveness, like he suddenly remembered that I was capable of reading, of understanding, of acting. It all came to a head on a gray Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels too still and the light outside is flat and mean, when I heard my father's voice rise, not shouting, but tight, clipped, controlled, in the way only a man who's about to explode tries to keep from doing so. I was in the hallway, sorting through a pile of mail that had been sitting untouched on the console table for days, when I heard the unmistakable sound of his phone call ending in a sharp, angry slam of the receiver against the table, followed by a muttered string of words I couldn't quite make out, but which were clearly not meant for polite company. I stood still, holding a credit card offer addressed to my mother, and waited. A moment later, his voice came down the hallway, not loud but deliberate. "Laura, can you come in here?" That tone, the one that pretends to be casual but is actually coiled tight, made my stomach twist, not because I was afraid, but because I knew this was the moment he'd finally stopped pretending nothing was happening. I stepped into his office, really just the converted den where the old computer still wheezed through startup screens, and found him standing near the desk, arms crossed, the cordless phone still buzzing in its dock like it hadn't yet recovered from the impact. He didn't look at me right away, just stared out the window like the answers might be hiding in the neighbor's hydrangeas, then finally turned and said, "Did you touch the business account?" There it was. The question. No preamble, no softening. Just the direct ask. I met his eyes without blinking. I removed myself. He frowned, like he didn't understand the sentence. "What do you mean, removed yourself?" "I mean, I'm no longer listed as the secondary on the Amex," I said, slowly, as if speaking to someone who had forgotten that I knew how systems worked, that I understood forms and authorizations and the quiet, efficient ways money moved. "I've been handling your payments for 3 years, and I decided I'm done." His face changed, just slightly, but enough that I could see it, the way you might notice a crack forming in a windshield before it spiderwebs. "You didn't tell me." "No," I said, "I didn't." He exhaled through his nose, the way he used to when we were kids, and he was trying not to yell. "You don't get to just decide that, Laura." I laughed quietly, but with genuine amusement, because in that moment it struck me how absurd it was that after years of doing everything without being asked, now that I had taken something away, now it was suddenly an issue of consent and communication. "I've been deciding things for this family for years, Dad. You just never noticed." His jaw clenched, and for a moment he said nothing. I could see the words he wanted to use lining up behind his teeth, but he hadn't chosen one yet. Was it going to be ungrateful? Petty? Irresponsible? I'd heard all of them in various flavors over the years, usually lobbed from Rick's mouth, but now my father looked like he was choking on his own sense of wounded pride, trying to figure out how to make me the problem without having to acknowledge how much I'd done. "You could have just said something," he finally muttered, turning away again, his voice low and tired. "I did," I replied, my voice steady. "You just didn't hear me. You never hear me until something stops working." He didn't answer, didn't turn, just stood there with his back to me, his hands tightening around the edge of the desk like he needed something to hold on to. When I left the room, the silence that followed was different, Not the tight, suspended kind from before, but something heavier, denser, like the kind of silence that follows a deep crack in ice, the kind that makes everyone afraid to take another step. Later that evening, I found my mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with more force than necessary, her shoulders tight, her mouth set in that brittle line she wore whenever my father was upset, but she wasn't sure how to fix it. She didn't say anything when I walked in, just kept slicing, the knife clicking against the cutting board like a metronome counting down the seconds until someone snapped. "I didn't mean to hurt him," I said quietly. She paused, but didn't look up. "He's just surprised. You've always been the one who helps." "I'm tired of helping people who don't respect me," I said, not angrily, just plainly, as if stating a fact. "And I'm tired of being used as the glue for a family that would rather pretend I'm not there." She finally looked at me then, her eyes wide and a little wet, and I saw something in her expression that almost looked like regret. But she didn't say anything. And I didn't ask her to. Because some things, once said, can't be unsaid, and some silences are just loud enough to do the talking. There comes a moment in every quietly obedient person's life, usually not marked by anything grand or cinematic, but more often by something subtle, even mundane, when the silence they've carried for years becomes heavier than the burden it once protected. And in that moment, when the walls finally begin to echo back their own unspoken exhaustion, the only thing left to do is walk away from the wreckage with a kind of cold, deliberate grace that no one ever expected them capable of. For me, that moment arrived just 2 days after the confrontation with my father, not in a flurry of raised voices or slammed doors, but in the quiet click of a mouse and the simple decision to reallocate what remained of my own dignity before anyone else tried to take a piece of it. I hadn't planned to leave the house, not permanently, not yet, but I knew I needed space, a distance both physical and emotional, to figure out where I ended and where they had blurred me into someone unrecognizable. The years I had spent folding myself into the narrow confines of their expectations, the years spent solving their problems before they even acknowledged them, had worn me into a shape that no longer fit anywhere comfortably, not in that house, not in the family dynamic, and certainly not in my own skin. So I packed a bag, just one, just enough for a week, and left it at the foot of my bed like a declaration I didn't need to say out loud. It wasn't for dramatic effect, it was preparation, the same way you check your smoke alarms and keep bottled water for a storm that hasn't come yet but surely will. That morning, before anyone else was up, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open once more, the cursor blinking on a blank email like it was daring me to follow through. I could have let things lie. I could have left the trip canceled, the accounts locked, the silence unbroken. But something about the weight of unfinished business pressed at me, something about the way my father's voice had cracked under the weight of not knowing, the way my mother's eyes had failed to meet mine in the kitchen, the way their disappointment was wrapped in confusion instead of reflection, and I realized that what I wanted wasn't vengeance anymore. It was clarity. Maybe even closure, though I wasn't naive enough to expect it. So I wrote the email, addressed not to Rick or Jess or any of the other leeches that had fed off my compliance, but to Angela, the travel agent who, ironically, had been the most respectful person involved in this entire fiasco. I explained that I wanted to reinstate the trip, not for everyone, not as a group, but just for my parents. I asked her to remove Rick's name from the booking entirely and to adjust the accommodations to reflect only 2 guests. I told her to charge the remainder from the balance I'd transferred back into my parents' account, the account they still didn't realize I'd replenished when I canceled the trip. I even asked if she could include a handwritten itinerary, something my mom would appreciate, tucked inside a welcome packet at check-in. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't peace. It was a gesture, a message in a bottle thrown into the tide of everything left unsaid between us. As I hit send, I felt that strange combination of relief and sadness, the kind that settles in your bones when you finally do the right thing, even when no one asked you to, even when it might go unnoticed, or worse, be misunderstood as an apology. It wasn't. I wasn't sorry, not for canceling, not for locking them out, not for saying what I said in that cramped office full of receipts and silence. What I regretted was that it had taken me so long to stop waiting for someone else to speak up for me. Later that day, I stood in the hallway near the kitchen and listened as my father opened his email. I heard the faint ding of the notification, followed by a pause, a long one, thick enough to fill the entire house, and then the sound of a chair scraping the tile as he stood, phone in hand. He didn't call me into the room. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked past the hallway where I stood and gave a single, brief nod. Not approval. Not even understanding. Just acknowledgement. For a man like him, that was as close to a thank you as I was ever going to get, and I took it for what it was, a fractured offering, a silent concession that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the edges of the person he had so long overlooked. My mother didn't say anything, not right away, but that evening I noticed she had washed my favorite coffee mug, the chipped one with the faded bookstore logo I'd clung to since college, and left it on the counter beside the coffee pot. Again, not a word, not a speech, but something small and intentional, and for her, that was enough. I spent that evening in my room, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the open suitcase, flipping through old texts on my phone, not out of nostalgia, but curiosity, wondering if I'd missed any earlier signs of who these people really were, or if I'd just ignored them in the name of family. Near the bottom of the list was a message from Jess, sent just a few hours prior, simple and pointed. "Why are you doing this?" I stared at it for a long time, letting the weight of her entitlement sit there like a stone, amazed at how someone could still see themselves as the victim after years of silent cruelty. My response was brief, but not cold. I typed it slowly, deliberately, each word chosen like a stone laid into the foundation of a new structure. Because no one believed I could. And then I hit send. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't even replay the confrontation with my father like I had the night before. I just lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the soft rustling of trees outside the window, and felt, for the first time in years, like the house didn't own me anymore. I knew I'd leave in the morning, not with bitterness, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had finally reclaimed something important, not just her voice, but her value. I'd stay with an old friend for a week or two, figure out what came next, maybe look for a job that didn't involve managing other people's lives. For once, I would write my own script, not wait for someone else to hand me lines they thought I should read. I never told them everything. I didn't need to. Let them wonder. Let them sit with the discomfort of questions they were too afraid to ask, and answers they never bothered to earn. Sometimes, being the disappointment gives you a freedom no one else in that room ever had. And I was done being quiet.